Y'all, Scream is not just a good movie, it is the line in the sand. It is the benchmark for horror. It demarcates eras in horror. There is pre-Scream slashers in horror, and then there's post-Scream slashers in horror. But to understand why Scream hits so hard, why this movie is the legendary piece of cinema that it is, you have to understand how dead the slasher genre was by the mid 90s. And you're talking about basically the sum total of horror. There's not much doing at this point. By the time 1996 rolled around, Halloween, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, they had all been sequeled into the ground. Most of those franchises were running on fumes by this point, coasting on brand recognition and increasingly goofy and bombastic kills. The serious horror energy of the 90s had migrated to prestige thrillers like Silence of the Lambs, where serial killers lived in FBI case files, not in suburbia with a butcher knife. Teen slashers, at this point, they were mostly a joke, direct to video fodder, something that you rented on a whim when you were really diving deep into the aisles of the horror section. But you forgot it by Monday. That's the climate that Scream was born into. A genre people thought they already knew, they had already gotten bored with, and there was nothing more to be done. The story of the birth of Scream starts with Kevin Williamson, a struggling screenwriter in the mid 90s. He told one script, Killing Miss Tingle, but he wasn't some powerhouse name in the industry. He was house sitting. He was broke and watching a true crime documentary about serial killer Danny Rolling. It freaked him out enough that when he noticed a window open in the house, he armed himself with a knife and called a friend. That fear turned into creativity. The next morning, he had a nightmare, woke up, and started writing. And in 3 days, listening to John Carpenter's Halloween score on repeat, Williamson cracked out a slasher script about a small town girl being stalked by a phone obsessed killer in a mask. And he called the script Scary Movie. His idea wasn't just, let's do a slasher. His idea was, what if the characters know the rules of slasher movies and the movie still finds ways to kill them off anyway? He consciously exposed the tropes, the rules that Randy talks about. He lets the characters talk about other horror films, but still played the killer straight and not as a parody. He set it in a quiet American town modeled after his own North Carolina hometown because he loved the contrast of wholesome suburbia versus brutal violence. He didn't even think the script would get made. He thought it might just be something flashy enough to get him more traditional work. Instead, it kicked off a bidding war. By 1995, studios like Morgan Creek, Paramount, Universal, and even Oliver Stone were sniffing around the script. Ultimately, it went to Miramax's genre label, Dimension Films, who bought it for roughly $400,000 to $500,000, promising they'd actually make it right away. That script, Scary Movie, would go on to become the legend that is Scream. Now, you have one half of the dynamic duo that brought this thing to life. The other half, a little known director named Wes Craven. If Williamson was the brain, then Craven was the spine. By the 90s, Craven was already horror royalty. The Last House on the Left, The Hills Have Eyes, A Nightmare on Elm Street, the man defined a genre, watched the genre fall to pieces, and then stepped back in to shake things up and really lay the groundwork for what would become Scream. And crucially, he had already experimented with meta horror in doing it. Wes Craven's New Nightmare in 1994 was a film where Freddy Krueger bleeds into the real world and haunts the actors from the earlier movies. It's a demon that has taken to liking the form of Freddy. And so you have this departure from what was normative by that point in time. And you have what is really a birth of an entire subgenre within horror. So when Dimension wanted a director who could handle a slasher that was bloody and scary, knew it was a movie, but didn't tip into parody, Craven was the guy, right? He almost passed on it though. Horror had taken a beating critically at this point, and Craven was tired of being pigeonholed. But the blend of Williamson's script, the self awareness, the chance to do something new with the genre pulled him back in. The combination of Williams' smart, fast dialogue and Craven's ruthless precision and ability to capture a scene in staging horror turns out to be the secret sauce that brings magic to the big screen. A big part of why Scream is legendary is because the cast also hits hard. You've got the GOAT, Sidney Prescott. Nev Campbell was coming off of Party of Five at the time, and she brings this mix of fragility and backbone that makes Sidney feel real, feels like a real person, right? She's not just the virgin who lives. She's traumatized by her mother's murder. She's publicly judged because of it, and she's trying to figure out who she is while everyone projects onto her. Sid is the evolution of the final girl into someone with a psychological life. not just survival instincts. And then juxtaposed against her is Gale Weathers. Courtney Cox had been Friends royalty at this point, right? She had that Friends heat, and she fought for the role of Gale because she wanted to play somebody bitchy, somebody different than Monica. That was against her sweetheart TV image, right? So Gale is ruthless and ambitious and morally compromised, yet completely charismatic. She's not a disposable adult in a teen's way. She is an active force in the narrative. She's chasing the story as the killings unfold. I would argue that this first one is the height of the Gale character. Now, then you have Dewey, right? Originally written as a more traditionally macho character, Dewey became softer, more awkward, and more lovable after David Arquette's casting call. He undercuts the cliche of the tough small town cop with his sweet, quaint, bubbling sincerity. He gives the film warmth and heart. Without Dewey's scream, just would come across as a lot colder. And then, of course, you have your big bads, Billy Loomis and Stu Macher. Skeet Ulrich and Matthew Lillard bring these characters to life. Billy is the brooding boyfriend with intense eyes and secret resentment. Stu is the hyperactive wildcard who acts like he's in a comedy until you realize he's not joking. The twist of two separate killers, in and of itself, was genre bending. It let the movie play fair with clues. Have Ghostface appear in multiple places at once and let the final reveal feel both shocking and earned the entire time, right? I've had the pleasure of being in the room twice with two different people watching this for the first time and watching them go on the ride. Go on the ride basically through the entirety of the party scene where you're kind of in that final stretch where different things are happening, and then Billy is thought to be dead, and then is it Randy? Are they going to make him a secret bad guy? And the whole time, Stu, even though he is like overtly stated, I think everyone looks at that from a expecting the twist standpoint, that you look at Randy and you're like, oh man, are they actually going to make him bug nuts? And the whole time it's like, no, we're actually playing this straight. All of those times it's Stu, you thought that he was just trying to get a rise out of people. No, there was something more to what was happening there. And then Billy pulling off this scene that he wanted to pull off because in his mind, everything's a movie. And so he wants to stage this scene just to screw with Sid and the whole nine yards. And you have all of these pieces coming together that culminate in the big reveal. And in a murder mystery style story, a lot is riding on the suspense of not knowing where exactly the movie is going to go next and how they're actually going to play it through to the end. And then once you let the genie out of the bottle, once you let the cat out of the bag, it's kind of hard to unring that bell. And so a lot of times movies that are in this situation lose something inherent. You could still maybe enjoy watching the performances or still enjoy aspects of them, but they just are always something a little lesser once you know exactly what the twist is. That is exactly what Scream is not. This movie thrives in all of its negative space. And so you have this reveal where it's twist and then double twist, and you're sent reeling that by this point, it's very textbook. At this point, if you are a fan of the genre, you are going to see every single influence that's peppered throughout this movie, every single piece of inspiration. This is where it is the most true to form, because up to this point, you've sent people reeling so hard and they're so invested in the story that it doesn't matter that at this point you're at formula with a final girl who is arguably the absolute greatest to ever hold that title. And one of the reasons why theorists and who killed who creators and different people that kind of segment out the lore to explain it, one of the reasons why you can do all of that is because the scenes are presented in a way where there are things that are happening outside of the parameters of just what's being shot in front of you. And the actors, the caliber of actors that bring this thing to life, the ensemble cast that bring this thing to life, coupled with Roger L. Jackson, just bring this world that's already big and active to life. And one of the best examples of that is the opening sequence, right? Zach Cherry made, I believe, the definitive take on who killed who. I don't necessarily agree with him. I think it makes more sense for it to have been Stu that did the deed. But regardless, he goes to great lengths to really outline everything that's implied and what would have to be in order for the killers to move from point A to point B. And within this conversation of the cast sits Drew Barrymore, a star already, somebody who was set to play Sid and became the center of the biggest marketing trick that this movie had to pull. See, Barrymore wanted to have an impact on this movie, but she thought her impact could be as the opening kill. And she would set the ship and set the tone of the movie by having this actress that has the ability to do all of these things and putting her in the context of, you are the one that is selling the gravity of the situation. You are the one who is setting the severity of what's actually happening in those opening moments. And she was featured heavily in the posters and the promotion, and if she, as if she were the lead. And then Scream kills her in the first 12 minutes. That's psycho moves, right? Janet Leigh getting killed halfway through. But Craven and Williamson put it right at the very beginning, weaponizing the audience's expectations immediately, setting you off kilter for the rest of the movie. Now, the first week of production was just the opening scene with Casey. They shot it like it was its own mini film, and it shows. Barrymore and Craven worked out personal emotional triggers to get her into that historical state. The voice of Ghostface, Roger L. Jackson, was actually kept physically separate from her. He was outside the house making the calls so she could hear him but couldn't see him, making it even more unsettling. The mask that they ended up using wasn't designed for the movie. It was a pre-existing Halloween mask from Funworld with its own lineage of controversy. A wild production story that's made the rounds. When the studio saw an early cut of the opening, they freaked out. According to Skeet, Miramax briefly halted the production after watching Barrymore's brutal death, not understanding the tone and fearing that it was just too extreme. Craven and the producers had to quickly cut a polished version of the scene and send it to New York to prove that it worked before they were allowed to continue. Now, today, that opening is considered one of the greatest cold openings in horror history. It's a masterclass in tension, in pacing, in shock value. The British Film Institute literally calls it an all-time great pre-credit scene. Now, the single biggest thing that people associate with Scream is its meta sensibility. Characters reference Halloween, Friday the 13th, Prom Night, Psycho, and A Nightmare on Elm Street, all by name with opinions about these movies. They know they're in a horror movie-like scenario, and they talk openly about it. No one embodies this more than Randy, the video store clerk who lays out the rules for surviving a horror movie. You can never have sex, you can never drink, and you can never do drugs. Never, ever say, "I'll be right back." For the longest time, I refused to say, "I'll be right back," when I left. Now, what separates this from a straight up parody is that Scream lets the characters recognize the genre but doesn't let them escape it. Randy knows the rules and still almost dies. Stu mocks the cliches and embodies one. Billy and Stu literally outline the motive cliche. Motives don't create psychos, they make psychos more creative and still fall into the exact trap they claim to transcend. The movie is laughing with horror movies and at them, but the knife, that still cuts. Critics at the time pointed out that Scream was doing something unusual. It was both an effective slasher and a commentary on slasher movies. Some loved that. Others thought it was self-parody, diluting the suspense. Either way, nobody could say that it was just another mass killer sequel. Now, the meta angle is great and all, but Scream wouldn't be legendary if it weren't actually scary and well made. Craven and production designer Bruce Miller wanted the horror to invade places that felt safe. Bright, airy suburban homes with big windows, a cozy high school, a house party that feels like a fun refuge until the bodies start dropping. Most 80s slashers leaned into dreary and grimy atmospheres. Scream is sunny, open, familiar. That contrast makes violence more shocking. The movie is structured almost like a whodunit. Billy is suspicious from the jump. Stu seems too ridiculous to take seriously. He's that guy that lasts about 3/4 through the movie, but finally gets it in some ridiculous fashion. The dad disappears. Cops are incompetent. Red herrings hit you on a constant basis. The movie wants to keep you just slightly off kilter. Craven stretches and snaps the tension. Phone calls that start flirty and turn sinister. Quiet walk and talks that suddenly spike into attacks. Moments of comedy slammed right up against moments of true horror. He never loses control of the tone at any point in the movie. Then you have Marco Beltrami's score that brings a Western influence, almost tragic, somber feel to some of the cues. It's not just scary stings. There's a melancholy underneath that especially shows up in scenes with Sid that grounds the movie at its emotional core. And that's another reason why Scream endures. It's not just about random killings. It is about trauma, it is about gossip, and it is about media exploitation. Sid's mother, Maureen Prescott, is never shown alive in this series, but is at the core of the story. She was married a year before the film begins. The whole town was already turned upside down from a crime that became a story. Rumors of Maureen having affairs littered the ground. found. Cotton Weary was convicted, but Gale believes he's innocent. Sid testifying against Cotton and then doubting herself when the murders take place. Sid's stuck between grief and shame and public scrutiny. People talk about her mother in despicable ways, as if Maureen deserved what happened. That's heavy stuff for a slasher movie, especially at a time where its contemporaries were more about quips and bombastic moments rather than actual story and character work. And as Sid is wrestling with all of this, you've got Gale chasing ratings and a narrative the entire time. Wrong man convicted, daughter in denial, new killer proves I was right. She ambushes Sid for interviews. She exploits survivors on live TV, and she frames herself as Cotton's champion, but clearly is doing it for the spotlight. Years before the current true crime boom, Scream is already asking, what does it look like when someone turns your trauma into their career? Gale is not a cartoon villain. She's ambitious, she's smart, and she's capable, and deeply morally compromised. Her arc from vulture to reluctant hero is part of why the movie feels richer than a typical body count film. I think, like I said, this is the absolute peak of Gale as a character, and I think the franchise struggles with what exactly to do with that character going forward. The legend was born on December 20th, 1996, as Christmas counterprogramming. Teen horror dumped into a season of family movies, Oscar bait, and big studio comedies. It opened up against stuff like Jerry Maguire, 101 Dalmatians, Beavis and Butthead, Do America, and Mars Attacks. Industry people thought that this was absolute movie suicide. A slasher in December with mostly young, not yet huge actors was never going to work. Opening weekend, Scream made about $6.4 million. It was fourth place. The trades called it dead on arrival. And then word of mouth kicked in. Teenagers kept going back. People told their friends, have you seen this? This is actually pretty good. The film's box office legs were insane. It kept earning week after week after week. On a budget of about 14 to 15 million, Scream eventually grossed about $173 million worldwide and over 100 million domestically. Adjusted for inflation, that's huge. It became the highest grossing film in the Scream franchise, one of the highest grossing slashers literally ever. A financial proof of concept that horror wasn't dead. Hollywood had just been lazy. Critically, it got mostly positive reviews. People praised its wit, its charm, its self-awareness, even if some felt that it was too clever and it undercut its own scares. Over time, its reputation only grew. Empire put it on their 500 greatest movies of all time list. The BFI highlighted the opening as one of horror's most iconic moments. See, if you zoom out, you see that Scream is part of a lineage. In the 60s, Psycho slices open the idea that anyone can die at any time. Texas Chainsaw in the 1970s, Halloween right at the end of the decade, create the template for low budget horror, high tension slashers made for pennies on the dollar. In the 80s, you had Friday the 13th, Elm Street, and sequels galore that turned slashers into pop culture machines. And in the early 90s, prestige thrillers start to rise. Slashers go direct to video, and the genre seems to be dead. Then Scream hits. And it does three huge things. It reboots the slasher for a new generation. It proves teenagers will absolutely show up for a bloody R-rated horror movie as long as it respects the audience that's coming to see it. This wasn't some fringe indie experiment. Scream made meta mainstream. It made the average moviegoer comfortable watching characters dissect the genre while still being trapped by it. And it reoriented the genre toward youth and known faces. Scream helped push the trend of horror films casting recognizable TV names and up-and-coming heartthrobs, especially in the late 90s boom with I Know What You Did Last Summer, Urban Legends, movies like that. Now, after Scream, you get a wave of self-aware slashers, horror comedies, and films that are about horror itself, eventually leading to stuff like Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon, and Cabin in the Woods. It basically rewired the genre's DNA for at least a decade. So why does it still work today? Why is Scream still so legendary today? When a lot of 90s horror feels antiquated and feels like a product of its time, what makes this movie head and shoulders above all of the rest? Well, you start off with the fact that it's actually scary and it's actually funny. Most movies that try to be both with one way or the other, they fall off the horse someplace. Scream nails both. The phone calls are unnerving. The chase scenes are brutal and intense. The jokes land without diffusing the danger, and everything is shot in a way that begs you to play with the negative spaces. And that balance is rare. It has characters that people genuinely actually enjoy. Sid, Gale, Dewey, Randy, and even Stu. They feel like actual people with quirks and contradictions, not just archetypes. That's why they've carried across sequels and reboots and soft reboots. You don't just remember the kills, you remember who got killed, and how it felt. And the mystery structure keeps it rewatchable because a lot of things are happening as the story is unfolding. Part of it is the beauty of the story, but part of it is all of the little idiosyncrasies that are happening that invite you to consider little side angles, little theories, like the Tatum theory, right? And even once you know that Billy and Stu are the killers, you can rewatch and pick up all of the little hints. Who else they were hinting towards, the lines that double as foreshadowing, the times they alibi each other or others alibi them. It works as a slasher and as a whodunit, which is part of why fans obsess over who killed who in each scene of the movie. And the commentary aged better than literally anyone expected. Jokes about horror rules and media sensationalism and people blaming movies for violence, they all still track. If anything, they feel more relevant in the age of true crime podcasts, social media, and literal endless reboots. And the reality is, at this point, Ghostface is up there with Michael Myers' white mask, or Jason's hockey mask, or Freddy's fedora, glove, and sweatshirt. A cheap novelty mask from the Halloween aisle became an icon because of how effectively Craven framed it. That tilt of the head, that cloak drifting down a hallway, the image of Ghostface reflected in a TV screen. And within its own series, Scream is still the highest grossing entry. It is still generally considered the best or second best by both critics and fans. And it establishes everything the sequels either build on, remix, or argue with. Every new Scream has to answer to the original. Are the killers as memorable as Billy and Stu? Are its set pieces as iconic as the opening or the house party finale? There's a reason why we literally went back to the house, and there's a reason why it seems like in 7, we're going to be going back to the house. Is its commentary as sharp as the original's take on slashers and media? The fact that we're still debating in 2025 the legendary status of Scream and what it has to say is proof of how high that bar really is. Scream isn't just a good 90s horror movie. It's a desperate 3-day script that turned into a bidding war, a risk from a studio that nearly shut it down after the first kill, a comeback vehicle for a horror director who'd already changed the genre, a slasher that dared to explain its own rules and still make you sit in it. It walked into a genre people thought they were done with and showed everyone the body was still warm. In horror history, Scream stands at a crossroads. One hand reaching back to Psycho, Halloween, and Elm Street. The other one reaching towards meta horror, self-aware slashers, and the modern elevated versus trash discourse that it quietly cuts through. That's why it's legendary. That's why it holds up. Not just because Ghostface is cool, not just because it has a series of moments, but because the kills are gnarly, the story is deep, the characters are rich, and the dialogue is quotable. It's legendary because it proved that horror could look at itself in the mirror, laugh at what it saw, and still draw blood. If you want, this is a movie that defined a generation. This is a movie that, in and of itself, paved the way for another genre defining movie just a couple of years later with Blair Witch. And it is another note in the legacy of one of the most important directors, not just in horror, but of all time, in Wes Craven. Let me know what you think of this movie, what your favorite scene is, and we will catch you in the next classic movie review where we will be covering Scream 2. Until then, peace.